welcome to part one of our lecture on chapter three, ethical, legal, and professional considerations in assessment. So when we talk about the ethics of assessment and counseling, there are really a plethora of standards and guidelines that we use for evaluating tests and test usage. And when I say plethora, I mean a lot. There are several standards and guidelines available concerning the development and use of psychological assessment materials, and those can include the American Counseling Association's Code of Ethics, the National Board for Certified Counselors Code of Ethics, a joint document on American Education Research Assessment, the American Psychological Association, the National Council on Measurement and Education, known as the Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing, a testing document created by the Joint Committee on Testing Practices, so on and so forth. I'm just skimming the surface of all of the different assessment standards and guidelines that all of us have to use when we're using assessment and counseling. And for this class, there are a few of these that I want to highlight into a little bit more detail. So I'm going to preview them here, but the main ones that we're going to be talking about are the ACA Code of Ethics, the NBCC Code of Ethics, the Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing, and the Joint Committee on Testing Practices documents. So let's dive into it just a little bit further. One of the first of these is the ACA Code of Ethics. And the ACA Code of Ethics addresses assessment related ethics in Section E of the entire American Counseling Association Code of Ethics. Some of the components of Section E relate to competence, informed consent, test security, test construction, and the assessment process as a whole, as well as forensic evaluation. And when you're reading through your textbook, you can see that in Table 3.1, they provide you with a lot of detail on the principles related to assessment, but there are a few of these that I want to go into in a little bit more detail. So the first of these is the General Code of Ethics for Assessment. And the General Code says that the purpose for assessment is to guide client decision making, treatment planning, and forensic proceedings using multiple methods. And that assessment data should be understood and interpreted and used properly by everyone interested in that assessment. So, what this is trying to say is that as a clinician, you have an ethical responsibility to use assessment to help your client in what the client has said as their goals, to gather data through multiple methods, and to make sure that everyone who is involved in the assessment process knows what's going on, knows how to interpret the findings, and can use the information appropriately. There's also a code of ethics around competence, which says that counselors should only engage in assessment practices in which they are competent. So you will only give an assessment if you have been trained to do so, if you have experience with it, and you know the ethical reasons for that assessment. There's also a code for informed consent, verifying that we as counseling assessors need to engage our clients in informed consent so that they know what is to be expected of them in research. They have had the assessment process explained to them, they know how and what tools will be used, and to what extent the data will be distributed to others. And only once they know that information, they've been made informed of it, can they consent to going on further with this assessment. There's also a code of ethics around the release of data, which states that counselors only release data with the consent of their clients. So clients must give their counselor permission before that counselor shares any of that information with anyone outside of that assessment or counseling room. As counselors, we can use assessment to inform diagnosis, but diagnosis should only be given when it's appropriate for the client and only once it's considered in a culturally appropriate manner. Counselors are also required to use ethics in instrument selection. Specifically, they must carefully select assessments and should only account for the psychometric, or should do more than just account for the psychometric properties of the assessment. So, when you are a counselor, you're going to choose an assessment for your client that is valid, that is reliable, that has been normed on people who have similar identities to them, and you're going to use that information to also inform if this is an appropriate selection for that client at the time in their life where they're at, depending on what they're presenting with. As counselors, you're also going to pay attention to the conditions in which you administer tests. You're going to make sure that the environment for testing is conducive for an assessment, free of distractions, good lighting, adequate temperature, comfortable, and honestly, that it's just a good environment to be testing in. It's not just a completely blank room or one that's filled with entireties of distraction. So, making sure that you have conditions that are conducive for administration. As counselors as well, you have a multicultural issues code of ethics, which says that as a counselor, it's your intention to ensure that the tools that you use for assessment are culturally appropriate and that the results that you administer and give to the client have been influenced by their diversity variables. So you want to make sure that you're viewing the client in the context of their entire identity, their entire life, and in context of the world. In terms of scoring and interpretation, it is your responsibility to disclose relevant contextual information regarding the client, the environment of testing, and the testing itself when you are reporting assessment results. You'll see more of this in the second half of the semester when we start talking about the actual assessment report, but oftentimes this is going to be talking about things like how the client showed up on the day of testing. Were they well rested? Did they get a chance to eat before they were tested? Did the environment provide distractions? Did someone walk in and interrupt them? Was there a train going by that was making lots of noise? But also talking about the test. Was the test an appropriate use with this client? And reporting that in the assessment report so that anyone else interpreting those results can interpret them in the context of everything that was going on for that client. As a counselor, you're also responsible for maintaining the security of any instrument that you're going to use. So that means you are going to make sure that all testing keys are behind lock and key, and that all assessment materials are also kept out of plain view of the client. So if you leave the room, you're not just leaving everything open so that the client can rummage through it. You're making sure that you are keeping those items secure. As counselors and assessors, it's also your responsibility to avoid the use of obsolete and outdated assessments and results. So, staying up to date on what has been determined to be not applicable anymore or unethical to use and removing those from your test banks so that you're no longer using them with clients because it would be unethical to do so. In terms of assessment and construction, it's your responsibility as a counselor and assessor to engage in rigorous steps to ensure the psychometric integrity of a tool when you're developing your own assessment. So, if you are in the process of developing an assessment that you want to use, you need to make sure that it's a reliable and valid assessment, and that is your ethical responsibility before administering the assessment in a therapeutic context or sharing that assessment with other people. And finally, during legal proceedings, counselors need to provide objective assessment data based on their professional opinion of the client. So, as a counselor, if you are hired for a forensic evaluation, you need to make sure that you obtain informed consent from your clients. You engage in an appropriate counseling relationship and you clarify with that client that the relationship is for an evaluation only. You need to make sure that that information is declared on the outset of the assessment so that the client can make an informed decision about how they want to proceed moving forward. So, this is the ACA Code of Ethics. And again, this is just one component. This is just Section E of the ACA Code of Ethics that we use as counselors and assessors when using assessment with our clients. But we also have additional methods or codes of ethics that we use. And one of those is the NBCC Code of Ethics. And the NBCC Code of Ethics was developed out of the ACA Code of Ethics, as well as another ethics component that we'll talk about later in this document, the Rust Statement. But the ethics code for NBCC addressed 95 competencies that are organized into the following themes of how to ethically work with clients in terms of assessment. One of those is non malfeasance, which is our responsibility as counselors to do no harm to our clients. We also have a code of ethics to make sure that as counselors we are competent in the skills that we provide. We receive training, we stay up to date with our extra trainings that are required and any other competencies that are necessary for us to be able to administer a test or a psychological assessment. We also have beneficence, which is the promotion of client welfare, so making sure that we are doing the best for our clients. We have a code of ethics for veracity, which means that as counselors, we are to be truthful with our clients and be honest with them throughout testing. We also have a code of ethics that's called fidelity to counselor relationship in the counseling profession. And what this means is that as a counselor assessing a client, you have an ethical responsibility to facilitate a trusting rapport with your client, but also to have integrity with your client and towards the counseling profession. So you're going to abide by not just assessment counseling codes of ethics, but also just general counseling codes of ethics. So in other words, you're not going to sleep with your clients. You're not going to go out to the bars with your clients, be friends with them. If you're going to engage in a bartering service, making sure that it has an appropriate contract in place that it is beneficial to both parties. You also have a code of ethics towards your client's autonomy and making sure that you are maintaining your client's autonomy throughout the professional counseling and assessment relationship. And as a counselor, you are accountable to the professional standards and practices of the field. So, again, going back into your obligation as a counselor. And it's important to keep in mind with the NBCC codes that these codes are specific to all of counseling. But within these competencies, there are specific codes that relate to the testing and administration. So some of those can include things like, are you qualified to give an assessment? Have you engaged in informed consent? Did you ethically select the instrument that you are going to administer? When you're testing and interpreting, are you doing so by the manual of that assessment? And are you not using obsolete materials and results? So similar to the ACA Code of Ethics, which makes sense given that the NBCC Code of Ethics came out of the ACA Code of Ethics. But you start to see here how there's so much overlap between our codes of ethics, and unfortunately, we've only just scratched the surface on the different codes of ethics that are used in assessment and counseling. Another code of ethics that we use is the Standard for Educational and Psychological Testing. And this particular code of ethics provides testing standards and criteria for test construction and evaluation. This code really evolved to place increased emphasis on the responsibilities of test users and the need for fairness in testing. So, initially, this code emphasized that developers need to use a sense of honesty in test construction. There needs to be some amount of fairness. And over time, this has evolved into a need for test developers to use what we call truth in advertising. So, when we talk about truth in advertising, we have to give credence to the fact that when test developers are creating an assessment, they're allowed to make money on their assessments, but they have to do so honestly through truth in advertising. And what this means is that test developers need to inform the public about their products honestly. And that includes saying what the limitations of the test are, what the usefulness of it is, what the reliability coefficients were, what the validity test revealed, as well as who this test was normed on. Because without providing this information, it gets to be really easy for test developers to say, oh, my test is amazing and this is the best and you should use it because they want to make money on it. But the standards for ethical and psychological testing really work against that and saying, no, we have to have responsibilities as test users to have fair tests and fair advertising so that we're honest, so that people can make informed decisions about whether or not they want to use that test material. And similar to that, when someone is using a test, the standards for educational and psychological testing say that test manuals should provide evidence of both the reliability and validity of the test. So that can include information regarding the methods of estimating reliability, um, who the information was validated on, or the normed population, the intended use of the test, as well as just what we should be doing with the test after we get the results. And the standards for educational and psychological testing really emphasized this because previously, before these standards came into play, test developers didn't have to disclose this information in their manuals. But now it is required to be in those manuals. So again, test users can be responsible in their selection of tests as well as ethical in their utilization of tests with clients. We also have what's called the Joint Committee on Testing Practices documents. And the Joint Committee on Testing Practices was originally established in 1985 and it ended up actually disbanding in 2007. But when it was in place, it served as a forum for counseling and education related associates to collaborate for the common good for fair, accessible, and appropriate use of tests. And even though it disbanded, the Joint Committee on Testing Practices has offered foundational documents that continue to inform the ways that we use current codes of ethics. So they do so in four primary areas: responsible test use, three primary avenues: responsible test use, responsible and rights of test takers, and the Code of Fair Testing Practices in Education. So within the responsible test use, they established 86 competencies for proper use of different instruments. Within those 86 competencies, 12 of them were identified as minimum proficiencies for all test users. And those minimum proficiencies included things like avoiding errors in scoring and recording of scores, keeping test materials and scoring keys secure, using settings for testing that allow for optimal performance, refraining from coaching clients to the correct answer, and establishing rapport with the examinees to make sure that they can obtain an accurate answer of, or we can get an accurate representation of that test taker's skills. The Joint Committee also has established the rights and responsibilities of test takers. And as administrators, as test administrators, counselors should clarify the rights and responsibility of test takers and obtain informed consent before proceeding with any testing with a client. That means that test takers have a right to know the purpose of the testing, who will have access to their scores, how the tests will be used, and possible consequences of taking and not taking a test. As the test taker, they also have a personal responsibility, such as reading and listening to the descriptive test information, as well as informing the test administration of any special needs that they have and asking questions about specific concerns that they might have. And all of that needs to be established through the informed consent process. The clients need to know that they have a right and a responsibility to communicate with the test administrator or you as the counselor. Also, for you as a counselor, it's your responsibility to offer reasonable accommodation for counselors or for test takers who have disabilities. And that looks vastly different for each client, which then comes into a responsibility of making sure that you have enough information about your client before testing begins to know what their abilities are so that you can provide a testing environment that makes the most sense for them. And the third area that we got from the Joint Committee on Testing is the Code of Fair Testing Practices in Education. And this particular area within the Joint Committee outlines the primary obligations of professionals towards test takers, specifically in the context of education. This code focuses on the development and use of educational tests from the standpoint of fairness to all test takers, regardless of their age, their gender, disability, race, ethnicity, or other personal characteristics. These standards are not mandatory, but rather they're intended to inspire test developers and test users to consider the importance of fairness in all aspects of testing. So you can really see how, again, the Joint Committee on Testing Practice documents has really overlapped with some of our other codes of ethics while also moving us into the future of what we should strive to achieve with our testing methods and with our assessment, moving into fairness and making sure that our tests are fair for everyone. We also have two smaller areas of testing that come up in the assessment field, and one of those is the standards for qualifications of test users. And this was developed by the ACA Standards for Test Use Task Force and includes 7 competencies. And those include testing practice and knowledge, knowledge of technical aspects and test construction, knowledge of sampling techniques and norming considerations, test selection and administration to appropriately apply in the counseling context, test administration and interpretation of test scores, diversity considerations, and a general understanding of the ethical and legal considerations for appropriate test use and the documents that guide it. So you can see here the standards for qualification of test users, again, overlaps heavily with our ACA Code of Ethics and with our NBCC Code of Ethics, but yet it's an additional code of ethics that as counselors, we are responsible for knowing in order to meet the standards for test using. And I want to wrap this up by talking about the ACA position statement on high stakes testing, which really came out of the No Child Left Behind Act in 2001. And really, the ACA position on high stakes testing outlines the fair and equitable use of testing in educational purposes. So, saying that it's appropriate for us to use tests, use assessments in education, but it shouldn't be the only thing that we use to determine if a student needs to repeat a grade, if they need to move into a talented and gifted program, if they should skip a grade. We can use testing to inform that, but we shouldn't let that be the only determining factor in making those decisions because those are high stakes education testings, and we don't want to reduce a child or a student to only that test result. So, further into these standards, we have a couple of other things that stand out. And one of those is the responsibility of users in standardized tests. And this is the RUST statement. The RUST statement really lists responsibilities of test users around the qualifications of a test, test knowledge, scoring, and communication of results. And this is really a comprehensive way of saying that it is your responsibility as a clinician to know exactly if you're qualified to give a test, how you should administer it, how you should score it, and how you should give that information to your clients. We also have what's called the ARC, Standards for Multicultural Assessment, and these are the assessments that provide 38 multicultural assessment standards on things like advocacy, selection of assessments, administration and score of assessments, interpretation and application of assessments, and training of the use of assessments within the context of multicultural assessment. Because traditional assessments were not made for everyone. So it's our responsibility as counselors to follow the standards of multicultural assessment. And then, even further, as if we haven't gone into enough detail on this already, within the setting of counseling assessment, there are specialty assessment standards that may or may not apply to each individual counselor. And I threw some of these up on the screen here. Some of these are going to relate to whether or not you're a career counselor or you're a marriage and family counselor, mental health counselor, a counselor of substance abuse, and even things like ADA and pre employment testing, because there are specific standards in each of these areas. And as assessors and as counselors, it's our responsibility to know exactly which codes of ethics apply to us. And I know I've gone over a lot of these already, and a lot of these overlap, but there's a reason why I'm harping on that so much. Because as counselors, there can be this overwhelming desire to want to know everything. And in essence, we are responsible for knowing all of these things related to our codes of ethics. And there is a lot of overlap that can help us sort of streamline the process of what we know about what we're supposed to do to be ethical test users and consumers of test material. So, I know this is not the most fun information, but I appreciate you sticking with me. This is going to wrap up our first part of Chapter 3. So, you can join me for the second half of our lecture on Chapter 3, and I will see you all in the next lecture.